Under the blazing noon sun of Beverly Hills, amid the cheers of hundreds of fans, Ringo Starr, the Beatle of legend, suddenly burst into tears. Few knew that this man had once sunk into a private hell of alcohol and drugs. He drank until he lost his memory, smashed up his own house, and woke up in pools of blood and broken glass without any idea of what had happened. His family left, his friends turned away, and even the music went silent. A doctor once told him, "If you keep drinking for another year, you'll die." And yet, against all odds, Ringo came back a resurrection that felt like a miracle. He became not only the heartbeat of the Beatles, but also the steady rhythm of his own survival. Now, at 85, it seems he has everything: fame, fortune, and the respect of the entire world. But he still cannot escape the ghosts of his past, the regrets, the mistakes, and a secret about the Beatles that he has kept hidden for decades. What secret did Ringo Starr hide? And why is he revealing it only now? This is not just the story of a drummer. It is the journey of a legend and the untold truths behind that gentle smile of peace and love. Liverpool summer of 1940. German bombs fell on the city every night. Windows rattled, walls cracked, and in a small house on Madron Street, a baby let out his first cry. His name was Richard Starkey. Outside were air raid sirens. Inside was the weary sigh of a young mother, Elsie, who would have to raise her child alone. 3 years later, the father left, leaving behind an empty room and the faint smell of flour, the scent of a baker who would never return. Richard grew up among the rubble of a city trying to rebuild itself. His mother worked all day, then tended bar at night. The little boy sat alone under the stairs, listening to the fading footsteps of his mother, and learned how to wait in silence. One day, a sharp pain tore through his stomach. The agony spread until by the time the doctor arrived, his appendix had already burst. Richard slipped into a coma and spent nearly a year in the hospital. When he finally woke up, he couldn't read or count. He could only stare at the white ceiling and imagine being somewhere else, somewhere without the smell of disinfectant. But he survived. At 13, fate struck again. A tuberculosis outbreak swept through his school. Richard was confined to a sanatorium far from home. 2 long years, no friends, no mother's voice, only the ticking clock, the sound of breathing, and a metallic tap. One day, a nurse handed him a wooden mallet and said, "Try hitting the cabinet. It's fun." The dull, rhythmic thud echoed down the corridor, and for the first time in months, Richard laughed. No one knew it then, but that moment was when music entered his life. Music without words, driven only by heartbeat and rhythm. When he was discharged, people said Richard Starkey was slow, fragile, and destined for nothing. They didn't know that this same boy would one day lay down the beat that defined a generation. Dingle, the neighborhood where Richard grew up, left no room for dreams. Damp streets, cracked walls, the sounds of fights in the distance. There, if you didn't know how to fight, you got beaten. Small, quiet, and gentle, Richard learned to keep his head down to survive. One night, after narrowly escaping a brawl, he heard the strum of a guitar coming from a pub. No words, no lights, just a rhythm steady and raw. And in that moment, something lit up inside him. From then on, music became his refuge. He didn't tell anyone. He just tapped out beats on tables, doors, anything within reach. At 16, Richard got an apprenticeship at an engineering factory. The work was hard, the smell of oil clinging to his clothes. But there he met Roy Trafford, a man with an old guitar and a love for skiffle, a mix of jazz folk and blues. They practiced together in the basement, their sound blending with the clang of steel presses. Christmas 1957. His stepfather bought him a second-hand drum kit. Richard polished each piece, tried a few beats, and for the first time heard the boom chick that was truly his own. 2 months later, he played his first gig at the Cavern Club, the very place that a few years later would become the holy ground of rock and roll. From factory worker, Richard became the drummer for the Eddie Clayton Skiffle Group, then joined a rising act called Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. That's when he adopted the stage name Ringo Starr because of his rings and because, as he joked, it sounded like someone who'd be famous. At that time, the Hurricanes were more popular than a small local band playing nearby a group called the Beatles. In 1960, both bands were invited to play in Hamburg, Germany, performing night after night in cramped clubs filled with smoke and sweat. The air was thick. Girls danced on tables and guitars screamed through the night. Ringo played until his hands bled, drank cheap whiskey to stay awake, and kept drumming. Night after night, music was his only breath. It was in Hamburg that he met John, Paul, and George, three young men in a band few had heard of. When their drummer didn't show up, Ringo sat in. The room fell silent, then came alive with a new kind of beat, rough, imperfect, but full of soul. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it from that moment on. Ringo had entered the Beatles' orbit, and though the world didn't know it yet, it had just heard the first heartbeat of a legend. 1962, Liverpool was changing. Young men grew their hair long, wore round collars, and believed that music could define a generation. In a small flat on Admiral Grove, Ringo Starr received a phone call that would change his life. On the other end was George Harrison. Pete Best just left the band. "Want to come play with us?" On August 16, 1962, Ringo officially replaced Pete Best as the drummer for the Beatles. 2 days later, they performed at the Cavern Club, the same place where he'd once played his first songs. But this time, the crowd didn't cheer. They screamed Pete forever. Ringo never. The packed cellar echoed with boos. A beer bottle whizzed past his head and smashed against his drum. George was headbutted, left with a black eye. Ringo just kept playing head down, beat steady. He knew if he stopped, they'd be right. In those first weeks, the papers called him the thief drummer, the man nobody wanted. But for Ringo, the real fear wasn't being hated. It was being replaced. When the band entered Abbey Road Studios to record Love Me Do, producer George Martin frowned at Ringo's playing. A week later, Martin called, but not for him. He brought in another drummer, Andy White, to record the official version. Ringo was pushed to the side, handed a tambourine. No one explained, no one comforted him. Through the studio glass, he watched John smile. Paul adjust his mic, and George tap his guitar. Ringo forced a grin and shook the tambourine on beat, but inside he thought, "They're doing to me what they did to Pete." Weeks later, the song was released. Love Me Do filled the airwaves across Britain. No one knew the man shaking the tambourine was Ringo Starr, but in his mind, he made a silent promise. "No one will ever forget my drumming again." And then it happened. Beatlemania. 1963. From London to New York, from airports to theaters, the world echoed with, "She loves you and I want to hold your hand." Security fences collapsed. Girls fainted just to touch a drumstick that had slipped from Ringo's hand. Among the four, Ringo wasn't the songwriter nor the lead singer. But he was the face the public adored. Friendly, funny, unpretentious, the one fans felt they could actually love. They called him Ringo the Cute One. Every wink during an interview sent crowds screaming. And through the chaos, he just smiled, quietly keeping time. The man who kept the beat for the entire world. But behind the smiles and flashing lights, Ringo knew the truth. Fame never comes free. And the first price he paid was his health. June 1964. Just before the Beatles' world tour, Ringo collapsed during a photo shoot. High fever, acute tonsillitis. The doctor said, "You can't fly." The band had to choose cancel the tour or find a replacement. They chose the latter. A drummer named Jimmy Nicole was paid $2,500 a night to fill in. As the Beatles plane took off for Denmark, Ringo lay in a hospital bed watching on TV as his three friends waved to thousands of fans without him. He stayed silent. Only the faint tapping of his fingers against the bed rail broke the stillness. "I thought it was over," he said later. "All it takes is one man sitting behind my drums and I disappear." But fate didn't allow it. 2 weeks later, still weak, Ringo insisted on flying to Australia to rejoin the tour. When he stepped on stage in Melbourne, lights blazed, tens of thousands roared. The band rushed to embrace him, and in that moment, he knew he hadn't been replaced. Ringo never had the fastest hands or the most complex technique, but he possessed something no one else did feel. He was left-handed, playing a right-handed drum kit, giving his rhythm a tiny lag. A heartbeat's delay that became the soul of songs like Come Together, Ticket to Ride, and Something. Producer George Martin once said, "No one else keeps time like Ringo. He doesn't chase the beat, he makes time to chase him." From the man who was booed, doubted, and once replaced Ringo Starr became the quiet heart of the Beatles. He wasn't the lead singer nor a great songwriter, but he was the reason their music reached something deeply human. In 1964, when the Beatles landed at JFK Airport, over 4,000 fans screamed. John and Paul waved. George smiled. And Ringo once called the extra Beatle, simply bowed his head, raised his drumsticks, and whispered, "Let's play." From that moment on, he wasn't just keeping time for a band. He was keeping time for a cultural revolution. And when the lights shone brightest, the shadows began to creep in. In 1965, the Beatles were invited.